From the private diaries of Alara Vance, later Duchess of Alcester, recovered from the Northwood Abbey archives, we are afforded a glimpse into a life first defined by shadows and then remade by an unexpected light. The silence in Viscount Blackwood's house was a specific and calculated thing. It was not the peaceful quiet of a country morning, but the taut, thin silence of a stretched wire, ready to snap at the slightest provocation. My existence within its walls was much the same, quiet, stretched, and perpetually on the verge of breaking. I was a poor relation, a ghost in watered silk, haunting the edges of my cousin's lavish, debt-ridden life. My days were measured in the mending of lace Amelia had torn in a fit of pique, the balancing of ledgers my uncle, the Viscount, could not be bothered to understand, and the careful avoidance of gazes that saw me as little more than a piece of unfortunate furniture. My uncle, Lord Blackwood, was a man hollowed out by his own appetites. His charm was a thin veneer over a core of profound weakness. His kindness a currency spent only when he sought to purchase something of greater value. He saw the world not as a place of people, but as a grand ballroom of assets and liabilities. I, it was becoming increasingly clear, was being moved from one side of his mental ledger to the other. He intended to sell my future to settle his past. A simple transaction he felt required neither my input nor my consent. His choice of buyer was a Mr. Thorne, a man whose wealth was as new as his manners were coarse, his eyes holding the acquisitive gleam of a predator sizing up a particularly helpless lamb. The secondary architect of my gilded cage was my cousin, Amelia. Where her father was weakly cruel, Amelia was actively, creatively so. She was a celebrated beauty of the season, her laughter like the tinkling of shattered glass, her compliments laced with a poison so subtle it took a moment to feel the sting. She treated my quiet nature not as a disposition, but as a personal affront, a gray smudge on the vibrant canvas of her own life. My presence was a constant, dull reminder of the lineage we shared, but the fortunes we did not, and for this, she could never forgive me. Her taunts were the daily bread of my suffering, small, bitter morsels I was forced to consume with a placid smile. The announcement of the annual Blackwood Ball sent a tremor through the household. For the staff, it meant frantic, sleepless weeks of polishing silver and airing tapestries. For the Viscount, it was a desperate gamble, a final, glittering throw of the dice to maintain his precarious position in society. For Amelia, it was the stage upon which she would reign supreme. For me, it was to be the auction block. I knew, with the chilling certainty of the condemned, that this was the night the Viscount intended to finalize his contract with Mr. Thorne. The very air in the house grew heavy with the scent of beeswax and impending doom. I was to be dressed, displayed, and disposed of, my own will a triviality in the grand calculus of my uncle's survival. I wore a dress of pale gray silk, a hand-me-down from Amelia that had been deemed too modest for her tastes. It was the color of a winter sky, of quiet resignation. As I descended the grand staircase, the ballroom below was a churning sea of jewels and silk, the air thick with perfume and forced laughter. I felt like a ship without a rudder, being pulled into a glittering, merciless maelstrom. My uncle caught my eye from across the room, his smile a tight, proprietary thing. Beside him, Mr. Thorne watched me with an unnerving possessiveness, as if he were already mentally hanging my portrait in his garish, oversized manner. I felt a cold dread snake its way up my spine, coiling tight in my throat. To escape the weight of their stares, I sought refuge in the one room I knew would be empty, the library. It was my only sanctuary in that house, a place of quiet, leather-bound companions who asked nothing of me but my time. I slipped behind a towering shelf of forgotten histories, the scent of old paper and beeswax a balm to my frayed nerves. The distant strains of the waltz were a muffled heartbeat, a world away from my shadowed corner. It was there, cloaked in the blessed anonymity of the stacks, that I heard the voices. My uncle's, smooth and conspiratorial, and Mr. Thorne's, a low, guttural rumble of satisfaction. "She is a sensible girl," the Viscount was saying, his tone that of a merchant discussing livestock. "Plain, perhaps, but of good stock. She will not cause you any trouble. Biddable, you see, a most desirable quality in a wife." Each word was a small, sharp stone hurled against the fragile shield of my composure. Plain, biddable, good stock. They were not describing a woman, a person with thoughts and a heart that was, at that very moment, fracturing within her chest. They were describing a broodmare, a decorative object meant to be silent and useful. "And her dowry?" Mr. Thorne's voice was blunt, devoid of any pretense. "As we discussed," my uncle replied, a note of desperation coloring his practiced ease. "My debts to you, erased. And a small stipend for myself to see me through the next season. She is, after all, my ward, my responsibility." The finality of it washed over me, not as a wave of hot grief, but as a sheet of ice. The betrayal was so complete, so coldly transactional, that it burned away all the softer emotions. There was no room for tears. In their place, a strange and terrible clarity bloomed. I saw my uncle not as family, but as a stranger who would sell my soul for a few more months of champagne and societal approval. I saw my future, a long, gray road stretching into a bleak and loveless horizon. And for the first time, I felt not fear, but a spark of pure, unadulterated rebellion. I did not move. I did not make a sound. I stood frozen in the shadows, my hands clenched at my sides, the watered silk of my gown feeling as coarse as sackcloth against my skin. I listened as they sealed my fate, their laughter echoing in the vast, book-lined room. When the heavy oak door finally clicked shut behind them, leaving me alone with the silent, leather-bound witnesses to my humiliation, I did not collapse. I did not weep. I simply stood, and I breathed. In and out. A slow, deliberate reclamation of the very air they had sought to steal from my lungs. With a composure that felt alien, borrowed from some braver version of myself, I stepped out from behind the bookshelf. My reflection in the dark, polished wood of a tabletop was a pale, stern ghost. I straightened my shoulders, smoothed the gray silk of my skirt, and walked out of the library. I did not run, nor did I return to the cacophony of the ballroom. Instead, I found a small, deserted balcony overlooking the gardens, the cold night air a welcome shock to my senses. It sliced through the fog of betrayal, leaving behind a sharp, clean resolve. They had mistaken my quietness for weakness. They had mistaken my endurance for submission. It was a miscalculation they would, I vowed in that silent, starlit moment, come to regret. It was on that balcony, wrapped in a winter of my own making, that I first truly saw him, the Duke of Allister. He was a figure of legend in London, a man spoken of in hushed, speculative tones. The Iron Duke, they called him, or the Winter Duke, for he was said to be as cold and remote as the northern estate from which he rarely emerged. His appearance at any social gathering was an event in itself, and his presence at the Blackwood Ball was a source of rampant gossip. I had seen him from afar, a tall, severe figure cloaked in shadows and an aura of formidable solitude. He seemed utterly out of place amongst the frivolity, a hawk in a cage of canaries. He stood at the far end of the balcony, half hidden by the stone balustrade, looking out over the manicured darkness of the gardens. He had not, I thought, noticed me. I was grateful for the oversight. The last thing I desired was the attention of any man, least of all one with a reputation for such glacial severity. I drew my thin shawl tighter around my shoulders, the flimsy wool offering little protection against the biting cold. A shiver racked my frame, a tremor born of both the chill and the shock that still echoed through my veins. Then he moved. He turned, his dark eyes, which I had assumed were fixed on the distant trees, pinning me in place. There was no surprise in his expression, only a quiet, unnerving assessment. He had been aware of my presence all along. For a long moment we simply stood there, two solitary figures suspended in the cold night, the sounds of the ball a faint, meaningless murmur behind us. I braced myself for a polite, meaningless inquiry, or worse, a dismissal. What I received was neither. In several long, silent strides, he closed the distance between us. He was taller than I had realized, his presence blotting out the glittering lights from the ballroom. He said nothing. Instead, he shrugged off his own greatcoat, a magnificent garment of dark wool, lined with what looked like sable, and draped it over my shoulders. The weight of it was immediate and immense, a heavy, comforting shield. The warmth from his body still clung to the lining, a startlingly intimate sensation that chased away the worst of the cold. It smelled of winter air, leather, and something else. Something clean and faintly astringent, like pine needles. I opened my mouth to protest, to murmur some polite refusal, but the words died in my throat. He simply looked at me, his gaze steady and unreadable. "You will catch your death," he said, his voice a low, gravelly timbre that seemed to vibrate through the heavy coat now enveloping me. It was not a question or a suggestion. It was a statement of fact, delivered with an authority that brooked no argument. He then turned his back to me and resumed his vigil, staring out into the night as if he had just performed the most mundane of actions, like adjusting a cravat. And then I understood. He had been in the library. He had been there, in some deeper, darker shadow than my own, and he had heard everything. The realization should have brought a fresh wave of humiliation, of shame at having my deepest wound witnessed by this formidable stranger. But it did not. Instead, I felt a strange sense of relief. I was not alone in my knowledge. My silent suffering had not been entirely silent after all. It had found a witness. The Duke of Alistair, the cold, reclusive phantom of the Tun, had heard my sentence being passed, and his response was not pity, but a simple, profound act of quiet care. He had offered me his warmth. In the weeks that followed, the Duke's presence became a subtle but constant thread in the tapestry of my days. He did not call upon me at Blackwood House. He was far too clever for such a direct maneuver, which would have only invited my uncle's avaricious speculation. Instead, he orchestrated what appeared to be a series of coincidences, encounters so flawlessly executed they seemed like strokes of fate. He would be riding in the park during the precise hour I took my morning constitutional, his massive black stallion slowing to a walk as he passed, his gloved hand lifting in a brief, formal greeting. The gesture was small, but in the rigid world of the Tun, it was a public acknowledgement, a quiet signal of his notice. One afternoon, a small, unmarked box arrived at the house. The footman, bewildered, delivered it to me, for it was addressed simply to Miss Vance. Inside, nestled on a bed of dark velvet, was a single, perfect camellia, its petals the color of freshly fallen snow. There was no card. There was no need for one. I knew, with an instinct that felt as old as time, that it had come from him. It was a flower grown in the hothouses of a northern climate, a bloom coaxed from a winter landscape. It was a message I understood implicitly. Beauty could be cultivated, even in the coldest of places. I kept it in a small vase in my room until the petals, soft as old silk, began to fall. The true masterstroke of his campaign came in the form of an invitation. A weekend party at Northwood Abbey, his legendary and rarely seen country estate. Such an invitation was tantamount to a royal command. It was not something one refused. The Viscount was ecstatic, preening at this sudden, inexplicable elevation in his social standing. Amelia was beside herself with excitement, already planning a wardrobe designed to captivate the famously untouchable Duke. I alone understood the true purpose of the invitation. It was not for them. It was for me. It was an offer of sanctuary, a temporary reprieve from my gilded cage, extended under the guise of social obligation. Northwood Abbey was exactly as the rumors described it, a vast Gothic masterpiece of granite and stone that seemed to rise from the moors like a fist clenched against the sky. It was imposing, formidable, and undeniably beautiful in its severity. It felt like a reflection of the Duke himself. Yet, inside, past the intimidating facade, there were pockets of unexpected warmth. Fires roared in every hearth, their light glinting off the dark, polished wood and ancient tapestries. The air, far from being cold and damp, was filled with the scent of burning applewood and beeswax. The silence here was different from the one at Blackwood House. This was a silence of peace, of history, of solitude chosen rather than imposed. The Duke was a distant but observant host. He treated his guests with impeccable, if remote, courtesy. But I felt his eyes on me often. When Amelia made a sly, cutting remark about my simple attire at dinner, I saw his jaw tighten for a fraction of a second. When the Viscount tried to draw him into a boorish conversation about politics, the Duke would deflect with a clipped, chillingly polite phrase that ended the discussion instantly. He was a silent guardian, a fortress wall I had not known was being built around me. My true respite was found in the Abbey's conservatory. It was a magnificent structure of glass and iron, but it had fallen into a state of beautiful neglect. Dust motes danced in the shafts of pale sunlight, and ivy crept in through the cracked panes of glass. Rare exotic plants, long untended, grew in a wild, chaotic tangle. It was a forgotten world, a secret garden, and I felt an immediate kinship with its quiet, resilient inhabitants. I spent hours there, tracing the patterns of frost on the glass, gently clearing away the dead leaves from a struggling orchid. It was there he found me on the second afternoon. I did not hear him approach. I simply felt a shift in the air and looked up to see him standing in the doorway, his large frame silhouetted against the light. "The Paphiopedilum," he said, his voice startlingly soft in the quiet space. He gestured toward the orchid I had been tending. My late wife had a fondness for them. I confess, I have not had the heart to properly maintain this place since her passing. It was the first time he had ever spoken of her. The gossip columns had whispered of a tragic accident years ago, a beautiful young bride lost too soon, an event that had supposedly shuttered the Duke's heart and sent him into his long reclusion. His confession was not offered with self-pity, but with a simple, unadorned sadness. He walked further into the conservatory, his boots crunching softly on the fallen leaves. He began to speak of the plants, his knowledge of horticulture encyclopedic and surprising. He spoke of grafting techniques and soil acidity with the same precision he might use to discuss a military campaign. In that dusty, sun-drenched room, surrounded by the quiet life of forgotten plants, the Iron Duke vanished, and I was given a glimpse of the man beneath, Alistair. Later that evening, I found a book left on the small table beside my bed. It was a slim volume of poetry, bound in worn leather. Tucked inside was a pressed flower, a snowdrop, the first herald of spring. There was no note, but I knew. Every gesture was a word in a silent language he was teaching me, a language of quiet care, of observant kindness. He did not speak of love or affection. He demonstrated it. He had seen that I was cold, and he had given me his coat. He had seen that I was trapped, and he had offered me a sanctuary. He had seen my interest in a forgotten garden, and he had shared his knowledge and his grief. The final night of our stay, he sought me out in the cavernous library. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting long, dancing shadows over the towering shelves. He stood by the window, looking out at the moonlit landscape. Blackwood's financial affairs are in a more precarious state than even he realizes, the Duke said, without turning. His tone was flat, matter of fact. I have been aware of his character for some time, long before I saw you at the ball. He turned then, his eyes dark and intense in the firelight. I began acquiring his debts 6 months ago. Every loan, every marker, every foolhardy investment, they all lead back to me now. He is, for all intents and purposes, a ruined man. He simply does not yet know the full extent of it. The revelation hung in the air between us, as shocking and profound as a lightning strike. This was not a recent impulse. His protection of me was not a whim born of a single night's observation. It was a calculated, strategic campaign, executed with the ruthless precision for which he was famous. He had been building my fortress long before I even knew I needed one. Why? The word was a mere whisper, all I could manage. He took a step closer, his gaze never leaving mine. Because I have spent a decade in a winter of my own making, Miss Vance, a prison of grief and duty. And then I saw you, living in a cage not of your choosing, and you did not rattle the bars. You tended your own soul with a quiet dignity that I, in all my wealth and power, had long since forgotten how to muster. I saw in you a strength I recognized and a resilience I admired. I did it because I could not stand by and watch a man like Blackwood attempt to extinguish a light such as yours. The return to London was like descending from a sunlit mountain peak back into a suffocating valley. The brief sanctuary of Northwood Abbey had sharpened the misery of Blackwood House into an unbearable point. My uncle, buoyed by what he perceived as a triumphant social coup, was more odious than ever. He saw the Duke's attention as a sign of his own rising star, completely misinterpreting its true focus. His desperation, however, was a festering wound beneath the surface. His creditors were closing in, their letters growing more frequent and less polite. He did not know, of course, that they were all phantom hounds, their leashes held by a single, powerful hand. His panic culminated in a final, brutish gambit. He summoned me to his study, the room smelling of stale brandy and desperation. Mr. Thorne was there, standing by the fireplace like a smug gargoyle, his presence a physical manifestation of my dread. The Viscount did not waste time with pleasantries. He informed me that the wedding was to take place within the week. The contracts were drawn. It was done. A month ago, I would have received this news with silent, terrified resignation. But the girl who had returned from Northwood was not the same one who had left. I had felt the warmth of a greatcoat on my shoulders and the weight of a duke's protection at my back. I had been seen, truly seen, as a person of worth. I looked my uncle in the eye, the cold clarity from the night of the ball returning tenfold. "No," I said. The word was quiet, but it landed in the oppressive silence of the room with the force of a thunderclap. The Viscount stared at me, his face a mask of disbelief that slowly curdled into rage. "No? What do you mean, no? You insolent girl! You have nothing. You are nothing. I will not have my plans ruined by some fit of feminine hysteria. You will marry Mr. Thorne, or you will find yourself on the street with nothing but the clothes on your back." He took a menacing step toward me, his hand raised. "I would advise against that, my lord." The voice came from the doorway. It was a calm, dry tone that sliced through the Viscount's fury. A man I did not recognize, dressed in the severe black of a solicitor, stood on the threshold. He held a leather portfolio in his hands. "My name is Mr. Davies," he said, stepping into the room. "I represent the sole proprietor of your consolidated debts, which is to say, I represent the man who now owns this house, its contents, your country estate, and every last shilling to your name." Viscount Blackwood paled, his blustering rage deflating like a pricked balloon. He looked from Mr. Davies to me, a dawning, horrified comprehension on his face. "This is your doing," he hissed, his voice a venomous whisper. "That damned Duke." As if summoned by the name, Alistair himself appeared in the doorway behind his man of business. He filled the space entirely, his presence sucking all the air from the room. He did not even glance at the Viscount or Mr. Thorne. His eyes found mine immediately, a silent question in their depths. I gave a barely perceptible nod, and it was all the confirmation he needed. He stepped forward, his gaze finally shifting to my uncle, and the temperature in the room plummeted. It was a look of such profound, glacial contempt that the Viscount physically recoiled. Alistair dismissed him with a single, clipped sentence. "Davies will see you out. You have 1 hour to gather your personal effects." He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The authority in his tone was absolute. The Viscount, a broken and sputtering man, was escorted from the room he had, moments before, called his own. Mr. Thorne, attempting to bluster, began to protest about his contract, but the Duke silenced him with a look. "Your contract is with a man who possesses nothing. It is therefore worth nothing. Leave." Thorne, coward that he was, practically fled. And then we were alone. The study was a wreck, papers strewn about, the scent of fear lingering in the air. It was the ruin of my former life. Alistair walked toward me, stopping a respectable distance away. He did not look triumphant. He looked grave, almost solemn. "You are free, Alara," he said, using my given name for the first time. It sounded like a vow. He stood before me, not as a rescuer to a damsel, but as an equal. "I do not offer you a cage, however gilded," he said, his voice low and earnest. "I offer you a partnership, a fortress for us both, against the world. I offer you my name, my protection, and my heart, if you will have it." He did not kneel. He did not need to. This was not a plea. It was a proposition between two sovereigns. Be my Duchess. I thought of the cold balcony, the warm coat, the single white camellia. I thought of a dusty conservatory and a shared, quiet grief. I thought of the strength he had seen in me, a strength I was only just beginning to recognize in myself. "Yes, Alistair," I said. "I will." Alistair was not a man to let a victory remain private. He understood that my vindication needed to be as public as my humiliation had been. He orchestrated the final act of our drama with the strategic brilliance of a field marshal. He announced a grand soirée at his London townhouse, an event that instantly became the most sought-after invitation of the season. Everyone who mattered would be there, their curiosity piqued by the reclusive Duke's sudden re-emergence into society, and the whispers of his association with the now disgraced Blackwood's penniless ward. The Viscount and Mr. Thorne, blinded by their own arrogance and desperation, saw the invitation as a possible olive branch, a chance to reclaim some sliver of their lost standing. They accepted. It was the final, fatal error in a long line of them. I stood by Alistair's side at the top of his magnificent staircase, greeting the river of jewels and silk that flowed into his home. I wore a gown of deep velvet, the color of a midnight sky, a gift from him. It was simple, elegant, and it felt like armor. I was no longer the ghost in watered gray. I was the woman who stood beside the Duke of Alistair, and I met every curious, speculative gaze with a calm composure that I no longer had to feign. I could feel Alistair's presence beside me, a solid, unwavering warmth. When the ballroom was at its most crowded, the air humming with music and gossip, Alistair raised a hand. The orchestra fell silent. A hush descended upon the glittering assembly. He did not need to raise his voice. His very stillness commanded the attention of everyone in the room. He rested a hand lightly on the small of my back, a gesture of possession and support. "I thank you all for joining us this evening," he began, his voice carrying with ease to every corner of the vast room. "I have an announcement of a personal nature. It is my profound honor and my great joy to inform you that Miss Alara Vance has done me the honor of consenting to be my wife." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. It was a shockwave of disbelief, envy, and frantic recalculation. I saw Amelia, standing near the punch bowl with her mother, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. I saw my uncle, his face ashen, finally understanding the true and complete nature of his ruin. The Duke of Alistair was not just his creditor. He was to be his successor as my guardian, my husband, my protector. But Alistair had not finished. He let the murmurs swell for a moment before continuing, his tone turning from warm to glacial. "This happy occasion has been somewhat preceded by the unfortunate but necessary business of relieving Viscount Blackwood of his various holdings. Due to what can only be described as gross mismanagement and certain moral failings, I have found it incumbent upon myself to assume control of his entire estate to protect the interests of all involved." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room. "Let this serve as a notice. His credit is non-existent. His social standing is forfeit." It was a public execution, delivered with devastating calm. He presented no proof. He needed none. His word was law. It was then that Mr. Thorne, his face mottled with rage and brandy, made his final mistake. He pushed his way through the stunned crowd, his voice a brutish bellow. "This is an outrage! I had a contract, an agreement with her guardian." He jabbed a thick finger in my direction. "She was to be my wife!" He turned his sneer on me, his eyes filled with a pathetic, wounded pride. "You preferred this cold phantom, this walking shadow, to a man of industry and substance?" All eyes were on me. The entire world seemed to hold its breath. This was my moment. This was the final test. I felt Alistair's hand tighten ever so slightly on my back, a silent offer of strength. But I did not need it. I drew upon my own. I looked directly at Mr. Thorne, this crass, cruel man who had helped orchestrate my sale. I did not raise my voice. I did not trade insults. I simply stepped forward, away from Alistair's side, and performed a perfect, deliberate curtsy, sinking low in my midnight blue velvet. It was the epitome of grace and good breeding, a gesture of polite deference. Then I rose, met his gaze, and said, my voice clear and steady enough to carry through the utter silence of the ballroom. "No, thank you." 2 words. It was not an argument. It was a dismissal. It was the closing of a door, the turning of a page, the final, quiet snuffing of a candle. It was more complete, more devastating than any tirade could ever have been. It was the distilled essence of my newfound power. The power to refuse, the power to choose, the power to say no. A wave of shocked whispers erupted. Mr. Thorne stood there, his mouth agape, utterly undone by a simple, polite refusal. He had been publicly neutered, not by a duke's power, but by a wallflower's poise. I turned back to Alistair. The look on his face was one I would never forget. It was not triumph. It was not even merely love. It was awe. For a long, suspended moment, he just looked at me, his dark eyes blazing with an emotion so raw, so intense, it seemed to steal the very air from his lungs. In that instant, I knew I was not just his Duchess. I was his equal. Later, after the last of the stunned guests had departed, leaving behind the scent of wilted flowers and scandal, Alistair and I stood alone in the center of the vast, empty ballroom. The candles had burned low, casting a soft, intimate glow. He took both of my hands in his grip firm and warm. "When you said that," he confessed, his voice rough with emotion, "when you looked him in the eye and delivered that perfect, final blow, I found I could not draw a breath. You are magnificent, Alara." He drew me closer, his severe, guarded face transformed by a vulnerability he showed to no one else. "I thought I was saving you," he murmured, his forehead resting against mine. "But I see now, I was saving myself. You have brought the spring to my endless winter." He lowered his head and kissed me. It was not a kiss of passion, not yet, but one of profound reverence and relief. It was the sealing of a bond, a promise of a shared future, a quiet beginning in the aftermath of a resounding end. We were married a week later, not in a grand London cathedral, but in the small, ancient chapel at Northwood Abbey. The only witnesses were the loyal housekeeper, Mr. Davies, and the ghosts of 1,000 years of Alistair's ancestors. We retreated from the world that had so nearly broken me, finding our sanctuary within the stone walls of the abbey. It was no longer a monument to his grief, but a canvas for our shared life. A year passed, marked by the turning of the seasons across the wild, beautiful moors. The conservatory, once a dusty relic of a sad past, was now my domain. Under my care, it bloomed with an almost defiant vibrancy. The orchids thrived, and the glass panes, now repaired, gleamed in the northern sun. Alistair would often find me there, his hands covered in soil, and he would simply watch me, a slow, genuine smile gracing the lips that the world had only ever seen set in a severe line. The staff, who had once moved about him with fearful deference, now adored their new Duchess, who knew all their names and treated them with a kindness they had never known. The Winter Duke had thawed. News from London arrived occasionally, like dispatches from a distant foreign land. Viscount Blackwood, we heard, was working as a clerk in a shipping office under an assumed name, a bitter, invisible man. Amelia had been forced to marry a grim-faced country vicar with a parish in the most remote part of Cornwall, her beauty and spite withering in the damp, unforgiving climate. Mr. Thorne's business empire, leveraged to the hilt, had mysteriously collapsed under a series of unforeseen financial pressures, a final, silent act of Alistair's far-reaching power. Their ruin was absolute, and we spared them barely a thought. One evening, as a soft rain fell against the library windows, Alistair and I sat before the fire, reading. It was a comfortable, companionable silence, the kind that exists only between two people who know each other's souls. He reached across the space between our chairs and took my hand, his thumb stroking my knuckles. I looked up from my book and met his gaze. The love in his eyes was a steady, warming flame, a hearth fire that would never go out. He had built me a fortress, but I had shown him how to live within its walls. We were not a rescuer and his ward. We were a partnership, forged in cruelty, tempered by kindness, and sealed in a quiet, unassailable strength. We were home.